Okay, you ready? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have a budget briefing on House Bill 29 and House Bill 30 that the conferees have worked on over the last couple of months. We are going to do a fairly in-depth view on this, and we have some people have some questions. We'll probably have some time to answer some questions, but we have our very capable staff back here from the House Appropriations staff, led by our staff director, Ann Oman, and Ann is going to open us up and maybe finish and going to give us an overview of our budget. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Glad to finally be here today with a conference report on the two budgets for you. First, just want to highlight some of the key themes in the budget. Given our extraordinary revenue situation with growth that has never been seen before, the conferees used a lot of that to buy down future budgetary commitments with one-time expenditures and also tried to address some long outstanding commitments and prepay some future obligations. Of course, there are also some rather significant investments in the core programs, specifically in the areas of public and higher education and health and human resources. We worked hard to maintain structural integrity to the budget. The next biennium is unlikely to be as flush with cash as this one is. So all of the ongoing funding in this budget can be supported even without revenue growth going forward. As you're aware, there is substantial tax relief in this budget for all Virginians, and I've got a slide detailing that coming forward. And finally, we utilized the remaining federal ARPA funds to help complete Virginia's recovery efforts from the COVID-19 pandemic. Just in terms of overall resource numbers, the caboose bill contains $29.2 billion in funding. This includes the $1.25 billion that became available in the mid-session revenue reforecast in February. The only reduction you'll see was the funding that was included in the introduced budget to reflect full conformity with the ARPA provisions related to the PPP loans and for tax year 21. We also expedited the elimination of the accelerated sales tax, moving that from June of 23 to, I guess this month, retailers will no longer be required to remit accelerated sales tax. In FY 2020, the upcoming biennium, you've got $31.7 billion in the first year and $28 billion in the second year. The reason that the first year number is far higher is because of the large carry forward. About $4.7 billion is unspent in 22. This comes from the revised forecast as well as last year's year-end surplus. You had funded FY22 fully last year, so those funds were not needed this year. In terms of the proposed tax policy actions throughout the budget, they reduce revenues by $4 billion over the 3-year period. And at the end of the biennium, we leave an unappropriated balance of $18.7 million. We'll note that this budget contains absolutely no fee or tax increases. These next two slides I won't walk through in detail, but for your reference, they are just the spending adjustments reflecting balances and transfers that we capture to help fund spending items. And this outlines the revenue changes tied to all of the tax policy legislation that was adopted by the two bodies. In terms of tax policy relief, as I said, it's $4.0 billion over the biennium. They're outlined there, the largest of which is $1.6 billion to increase the standard deduction from $4,500 for individuals, $9,000 for joint filers, to $8,000 and $16,000. Also eliminates the state sales tax on food and personal hygiene products at a cost of just about $375 million over the biennium. There's $1 billion provided in the current calendar year to provide checks of $250 to individuals, $500 to families. Those will go out late fall, early summer. You have the 4-year phase-in of the subtraction of $40,000 worth of military retirement income for all those 55 or older, an increase in the interest deduction allowable for businesses from 20 to 30%, $315 million to establish a refundable earned income tax credit at 15% of the federal level. And then I've already mentioned the accelerated sales tax, but that gets you to $4 billion. Overall, that would provide the average family of 4 tax relief of $1,108. There is also a lot of focus on shoring up our reserves, again, reflecting both constitutional requirements and the interest in keeping funds and one-time activities. In total, across the 2 budgets, you're adding $1.6 billion to the Revenue Stabilization Fund. There's $1.1 billion in 23, which represents the deposit that was required based on last year's surplus, and then a separate amendment in 22 prepays just under $500 million for the deposit that would be required if we meet the 22 forecast as is. It looks like we will again have a surplus, but we don't know what that amount will be, so the governor will remove the first portion of surplus revenues required to meet the remaining rainy day fund requirement for the current year's revenues. All told, that will get you to a record $3.8 billion in reserves across the 2 funds by 2023. We've also included in language that increases the combined fund total, which is in the code, from 15 to 20%, because we are now exceeding that. And there's language asking the Secretary of Finance, Money Committee staff, and others to look at this issue over the year to determine what sort of changes should be made to the deposit requirements on the 2 reserve funds. This slide just shows you the great growth you've seen in recent years. The green bar is the Revenue Reserve Fund, which you all established first in the budget in 2017 and the next year in code. And with that, I will turn it over to Zach for public education.
We should have the slides available on the live stream now. So in public education, at $19.2 billion in state funds over the biennium, this is the largest ever K-12 budget. This is $3.2 billion, or 20% above the current biennium. And the funding level exceeds pre-recession era funding levels when adjusted for inflation. It also meets the maintenance of effort requirements associated with the acceptance of the federal ARPA education funds. The conference report fully funds rebenchmarking. You may recall that K-12 rebenchmarking costs for this budget were atypically low because they were based on FY20 costs, and that was the year that schools closed 2 months early due to COVID. To address this, $350 million is included to recognize this data anomaly by using FY18 rebenchmarking cost data for certain funding categories rather than FY20. The K-12 compensation package includes over $860 million, including 2 5% salary increases for $730 million. This funds the state share of costs for 5% increases each year for SOQ-funded staff with effective dates of August 1st, 2022 and July 1st of 2023. In order to access the funds, school divisions are required to provide 5% increases in each fiscal year. However, school divisions can access a prorated portion of these funds if they provide at least a 2.5% salary increase each year. There's $125 million in federal ARPA funds included to provide a $1,000 bonus effective December 1st of 2022 for SOQ-funded positions, and for that bonus, there is no local match required. And also, $10 million is provided from ARPA funds for teacher recruitment incentives for the upcoming school year. And this would provide a $2,500 recruitment incentive per position, or $5,000 per position for hard-to-staff and hard-to-fill schools. For school construction, $1.25 billion is provided to support $3.15 billion in school construction projects. $450 million is included for targeted competitive school construction grants. These grants would equal 10, 20, or 30% of reasonable project costs, depending on the local composite index, or LCI, as well as the fiscal stress levels of the school division. Project selection for these grants will be based on demonstrated need, financial commitment by the local governing body, as well as existing building conditions. $400 million is included for formula-based school construction grants. This is akin to the proposal that was included in the introduced budget. These funds would provide a base payment of $1 million to each school division, with the remaining funds distributed on a per-pupil basis weighted by the local composite index. School divisions will be permitted to use these funds for school construction modernization costs, as well as to buy down debt service on capital projects that are less than 10 years old. The conference report also authorizes $200 million in literary fund school construction loans each year, as well as several enhancements to the literary fund school construction program, including lower interest rates that are indexed to market interest rates. Currently, those rates are set in statute at 2 to 6%. And also, larger loans will be available of as much as $25 million. Currently, the literary fund has a maximum loan amount of $7.5 million. Funding for several additional SOQ positions is included. This includes $272 million for additional support position funding. This would partially remove the funding cap that was placed on support positions in FY 2010, and would establish funding ratios moving forward for the next 2 years. There's also a staffing requirement included for school divisions to provide reading specialists at 1 reading specialist per 550 students in grades K through 3. This is included for $63 million is included over the biennium for this initiative. There's also language that provides school divisions with staffing flexibility while this requirement is phased in over the next 2 years. $20.3 million is also included to fund a full-time principal in every school. This provides funding for about 84 principal positions in smaller elementary schools that are currently funded fully with local support without state aid. With regard to retirement costs, the report includes $166 million in general funds to end the practice of partially funding teacher retirement costs with literary funds. This allows literary fund balances to be used to support the school construction financing package. There's also $145.7 million provided to keep VRS rates at their current levels rather than the lower rates that were approved for the upcoming biennium. This action improves the VRS funded status without any additional costs for localities. $158 million is included to hold school divisions harmless from the impact of the elimination of the grocery sales tax. And $145 million is included to increase support for at-risk students by increasing the at-risk add-on range from its current 1 to 26% range to 1 to 36% beginning in FY23. $100 million is included for the College Partnership Lab School Fund. These funds will be provided to help establish these partnerships with public institutions of higher ed, including $5 million in planning grants, $20 million for startup grants, and the remaining funds will be used to support ongoing per pupil operating costs. And finally, for early childhood education, about $67 million is included to initiate biennial rebenchmarking of VPI costs, as well as provide additional mixed delivery slots and services for additional 3-year-olds, as well as expansion of a recruitment program or recruitment incentive program to help meet early childhood workforce needs. And now Michael will discuss compensation.
Good morning. In the area of compensation, there is $447 million the first year and over $1 billion in the second year for a 5% raise in each year of the biennium across all employee groups. This includes the SOQ funded positions, as Zach just mentioned, in addition to the state employees and the state supported local employees. For the state employees, the first year, the raise will show up on their August 1st paycheck, which means it's funded for 11 months out of the 12 months. And in the second year, it would be the July 1st paycheck, so it would be a full 12-month raise so that we are structurally balanced going forward. There is language that says that if you got a targeted salary increase of above 7.5% in the first year, your across-the-board raise in the first year would be 2.5%. If you recall, in the House budget, that they wouldn't have gotten any raise in the first year, but in the conference report, they get a 2.5% raise in addition to the targeted salary increase. For the public safety targeted salary actions, this is consistent with what was in the House budget. It funds the state police pay plan that was included in the introduced budget. It increases the starting pay for the DOC and deputy sheriffs to $42K. Both of them are the same, so there's parity. In addition to that, there is a $3,000 raise for probation and parole officers. So the total is about $200 million over the 2 years. In addition to the increases in the starting pay for the state police, the correctional officers, and the deputy sheriffs, there are compression adjustments that increase the compensation for the longer tenured employees. And the average raise for the starting pay is going up about 20% for the deputy sheriffs and the correctional officers, and around 7.5% or a little bit above 7.5% for the state police. The next slide just shows the other targeted salary actions that are included in the conference report, the bulk of which is an increase for the direct care staff at the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services facilities to the median, which is it's a raise of almost 40% for these employees. It cost about $110 million over the biennium almost. In addition to that, there is funding for a $2,000 raise for district court clerks and a $1,200, and there's $1.3 million the first year and $1.5 million the second year for circuit court clerk staff to get a $1,250 raise. In addition to the raises that are in the budget, there is money for a bonus of $1,000 both for SOQ positions and for state employees. There's $66.5 million general fund for the state employee bonus, which would be December of 2022. And there's ARPA funds of $124.7 million for the SOQ funded positions. The conference report eliminated the premium increase for the state employee health plan in the first year. This saves the state $12.8 million general fund. It also saves the employees money because they don't have to pay a higher health insurance premium. The budget does retain funding for a premium increase in 2024 in case analysis next year shows that the premiums need to be increased to make sure that the fund is viable going forward. Lastly, there is money for VRS lump sum payments. There's $750 million in HB 29 to make a payment this month to address the unfunded liability. In addition to that, there's language in HB 30 that will provide $250 million in additional lump sum payments contingent on a year-end surplus at the end of this fiscal year. In addition to that, there's $80 million in lump sum payments to the VRS for the retired health credit. This is funded at a significantly lower percentage than the other plans because up until about 10 years ago, the retired health credit was funded on a pay-as-you-go basis. So the funded status there is hovering around 20%. This $80 million would get it to 30% by the end of the biennium. And next we will move to Susan Massett, unless there's any questions.
Good morning. I'll start with the just an overview of the Medicaid forecast. Middle of the page, that hasn't changed, but what I would draw your attention to is the offsets to the forecast. This budget recognizes some additional federal matching funds for Medicaid due to the extension of the federal public health emergency into fiscal year 2023 and per capita changes in 23 and 24 in the normal Medicaid forecast. So you'll see the bottom line is you have additional $890 million in total savings in the current year in Medicaid. And over the biennium, it's a net of about $244.6 million of spending for the forecast due to those cost offsets, which is highly unusual and something we haven't seen before to this extent. In terms of Medicaid provider rates, there is $377 million over the biennium to increase and rebase the rates for Medicaid DD waivers. There's another $86 million to increase personal care rates by 7.5% over their fiscal year 2022 rates for consumer-directed and agency-directed attendance. There's another almost $78 million to provide a 30% rate increase in Medicaid dental rates, the first increase that they've seen since about 2005. There's $38 million in ARPA funds and $43 million in the first year and then $43 million in general funds in the second year to continue the 12.5% rate increase that you put into effect last year for a variety of home and community-based services in the Medicaid program. There's also almost $38 million to support the value-based purchasing program for nursing homes. This will be an important step moving forward to incentivize higher staffing levels at those homes. There's $20 million to increase primary care rates to 80% of the Medicare rate, $8 million to increase rates for to take into consideration inflation for psychiatric residential treatment facilities. There's money in there that came over in the introduced budget for OBGYN services and vision services in Medicaid, and then smaller amounts to support CHKD Hospital down in the Tidewater area and Virginia Home that caters to a unique population of nursing home residents. In terms of Medicaid services, there's $13 million to fund 600 DD waiver slots in the second year of the biennium. You'll remember that there was some difficulties getting the slots out there this year, so those slots just started going out late spring. The increase is in the second year there. There's $3.5 million for brain injury case management services and language that would have the department develop a plan for a traumatic brain injury waiver program. There's also in the Department of Aging and Rehabilitative Services $1.1 million for non-Medicaid brain injury case management services. There's $2 million to support remote patient monitoring for certain patients in Medicaid, and about $500,000 to cover anesthesia for children's dental procedures. And then there's also language in there requiring managed care organizations to cover mobile vision services in Medicaid. In terms of behavioral health, there's a number of items here. As Michael mentioned, there's $55 million for the costs in 2024 of the direct care staff in state facilities, and that is also the first year is ARPA funding. In terms of the community services boards, there's $22 million in ARPA funds in the first year and $28 million the second year to fully implement the STEP Virginia program. There's about $34 million for permanent supportive housing and about $38 million to support the crisis system transformation. This will be mobile crisis teams, crisis receiving centers, and the Marcus Alert continued implementation in 5 additional localities. There's $10 million for a pilot program at Central State Hospital and Southern Virginia Mental Health Institute to provide discharge planning and therapeutic intervention treatment services. This will cover the weekends as well as extending a little bit during the week. And then there's about $7 million for discharge planning services. In terms of other health and human resources, there's $36 million over the biennium to fund the forecast for child welfare programs, foster care and adoption, about $11 million to replace the child welfare information system in the Department of Social Services, $8.5 million to phase in changes for the local match for the local health departments. You'll remember you passed a bill last year on this particular issue, or 2 years ago, I think. And then there's $5.3 million to add 300 public guardianships. There's $5 million in the first year for a CASA Welcome Center in Fairfax County, and then $5 million would be used to reinvest some of the savings in child welfare into other preventive services. I'll turn it over to Tony.
In higher education, there's about $254 million in the first year and $361 million in the second year over the base budget. The sizable portion of that is funding to support access and affordability, about $159 and $160 million in each year. $40 million of that is a technical adjustment, but the increased funding does support the House position to keep any of the tuition increases to no more than 3%, and in some cases, the institutions can probably keep it at a flat rate. There's financial aid funding of about $29 million the first year and $141 million. About $150 million total of that is for undergraduate aid. And then there is approximately $65 million in the first year and $59 million in the second year for institution-specific items. Significant among that is about $36.7 million for cancer research at VCU and UVA. A portion of the UVA funding is to support pediatric cancer research. There's funding for UVA-wise for rural economic development, $11.5 million, and then $15.6 million at Virginia State and $9.7 million at Norfolk State to support student access and success programs. At Chev, there was several items. Perhaps first foremost is there's increased funding for TAG to increase the award from $4,000, the current award, to $4,500 in the first year and $5,000 in the second year. This will increase the award for undergraduate students to that level, for graduate students, and then also make the online students benchmark them to 50% of that residential award. There's an additional $4.3 million in each year to do a TAG supplement for TAG-eligible students at Hampton and Virginia Union. $5.4 million to support increased subscriptions to the Military Survivors Program. $5 million each year for the financial aid for individuals that are now, that would be eligible now for aid but are not eligible for the federal programs. And then lastly, there's $25 million to help recruit and retain Pell-eligible students. And I'll turn it to Andrea.
Good morning. For capital outlay in HB 29, there's a total increase of a little under $400 million general fund and $6.1 million non-general fund. The largest piece of this is $350 million in general fund for a new project supplement pool to address inflation and supply chain issues. We've seen growth in some previously authorized projects, cost estimates of as high as 40% for the project cost. So this supplement pool, along with $100 million set aside in the contingency item, it's nearly $500 million that we have to address cost increases that we anticipate for already authorized projects. In HB 30, I'll use the tagline first. The most important thing here is that this is a very significant capital package, and it's $2.1 billion, all cash. There is no new general fund supported debt in this. So it prioritizes projects that were previously authorized and planned, which was a priority of the House. These projects were either were of an emergency nature, or they are improvements to existing space. This budget includes $1 billion general fund for higher education and state agency capital pools. That's 8 projects for the higher education pool and 11 for the state agency pool. This includes Randolph Hall at Tech, Mary Washington Fine Arts Center that were added. They were not in the introduced budget, as well as the State Police Training Academy. There's $362 million in general fund for 43 standalone projects, and $355 million general fund for maintenance reserve. And that includes also $45 million for state parks deferred maintenance. So really a focus on taking care of those facilities that we already own and not entering into additional debt. We already have about $6 billion in the pipeline. You've heard us say that before. And so this budget very responsibly prioritizes priority projects and uses all cash and no general fund supported debt for those. In general government, there's $17.1 million to address behavioral health care needs in local and regional jails. This funds 250 new positions by the end of the biennium across the state to assist with mental health needs in jails. There's $11.6 million general fund to increase the state responsible inmate per diem to local and regional jails by $3 from 12 to 15. This is the first time that per diem has been raised since 2011. And finally, a little less than $2 million general fund for unfunded and underfunded positions in local offices of treasurers and commissioners of revenue. In executive office, there's $10 million in the first year in central accounts for transformation office initiatives. There's $4.3 general fund over the biennium to phase in 26 positions at the Office of the Attorney General. The appellate court expansion that went into effect in January has resulted in workload increases that these positions are intended to address. And finally, $2 million general fund each year to support 10 positions in the governor's office, and that includes up to $750,000 and 4 positions each year for the transformation office. In elections, there's $2.2 million general fund in the first year for a statewide mailer to all registered voters, and $1.3 million general fund each year for a voter education and awareness initiative. Finally, there's $15 million that we added in central accounts for centralized funding for cybersecurity initiatives that are identified with the Secretary of Administration. And that brings the total to nearly $150 million of new specific cybersecurity initiatives that are funded throughout this budget. Kim will present Commerce and Trade next.
Thank you, Andrea. The conference report contains a significant investment in the Virginia Business Ready Sites program. It includes $159 million over the biennium, $50 million of which is contingent in FY23 on general fund revenue growth. Additionally, the conference report makes significant investments to increase the supply of affordable housing in Virginia through $150 million over the biennium invested in the Virginia Housing Trust Fund. Additionally, the conference report makes several updates to the Virginia Housing Opportunity Tax Credit to invest $255 million over 10 years in this tax credit program. Additionally, the report sets aside funding to cover the commitments to Amazon's HQ2 project up through FY27. That deposits up to $121 million, $35 million of which is contingent upon FY23 general fund revenue growth. Additionally, there are 3 projects included in the conference report to strengthen Virginia's biotech, life sciences, and pharmaceutical manufacturing cluster. After some additional reviews and approvals, the budget provides $15 million to the Virginia Biotech Research Partnership Authority for a life sciences building lab, in addition to a key starting materials pilot project. There's $36 million over 2 years to the University of Virginia's Institute for Biotechnology to help recruit research scientists to the state. Last, there's about $16 million for the city of Roanoke to develop a business incubator for life sciences. Additionally, all the funding for MEI-approved projects is included in the budget. And then finally on this slide, there is an amendment package to support the Commonwealth Center for Advanced Manufacturing. In terms of non-general fund spending, the budget includes $130 million in federal ARPA funds to fully fund all remaining applications for Rebuild Virginia, which is the state's COVID-19 business assistance program. There's an additional $30 million in federal ARPA funds to upgrade infrastructure In Petersburg, water and wastewater infrastructure, those upgrades are necessary to support the continued expansion of several pharmaceutical manufacturing businesses in the city. And last, it directs $11.4 million of non-general funds to provide flood relief to the residents of Hurley. Next, I'll turn it over to David.
All right, thank you, Kim. Moving on to Ag, Forestry, and Natural Resources. On this slide, we have a list of several of the substantial investments in water quality across the Commonwealth, supported by the conference report. The largest by far is the $313 million deposit in the Water Quality Improvement Fund in 2023. This includes a record-setting deposit in the Natural Resources Commitment Fund of just over $256 million, allowing the Commonwealth to fully fund the Ag BMP needs assessment through the biennium. There's a $16 million deposit included for the WQIF reserve, and this would increase the reserve fund balance by approximately 50%. From ARPA funds, there's $165 million to fully fund the request from Alexandria, Lynchburg, and Richmond for their combined sewer overflow projects. There's just under $90 million in ARPA funds included for 12 water, wastewater, or sewer projects across the Commonwealth, and $25 million deposited in the capital section of the budget for the Stormwater Local Assistance Fund. Other Ag, Forestry, and Natural Resources items include just over $21 million to support 19 historic and cultural attractions across the Commonwealth. There's a total of $10.7 million in new funding invested in state parks over the biennium. This is approximately a 9% increase in operating fundings for the parks. There's a total of $20 million, half from general fund and half from ARPA for the repair and rehabilitation of privately owned high-hazard dams across the Commonwealth, as identified by the Department of Conservation and Recreation. And finally, there is a 60% increase in the base funding available each year for the Virginia Land Conservation Fund. Moving on to public safety and veterans. The largest two items in public safety from general funds are at the top of this slide. This includes a $45 million investment in expanding support for the School Resource Officer Incentive Grant Program. This is approximately quadrupling funding available through the program. And there's also language within the amendment that waives all financial matching requirements in the first year. $47 million is provided over the biennium to fully fund the HB 599 funding available. That's aid to localities with police departments. And there's $13 million over the biennium for community violence-focused grant programs at DCJS. This includes $2.5 million per year for the Operation Ceasefire Grant Fund, as well as $4 million a year for the Firearm Violence Intervention and Prevention Program. From ARPA funds, $75 million has been provided for one-time grants to law enforcement agencies to support equipment purchases and training. $20 million over the biennium has been provided to support expansion of programming provided by the Department of Veteran Services. $5 million is provided in the Secretary of Veteran and Defense Affairs office for an infrastructure investment program in military communities. And just under $20 million over the biennium is provided to fund the operations of the Cannabis Control Authority to meet their statutory requirements. And up next is Michael with Transportation.
For transportation, there's $287 million in general fund earmarks in the House Bill 29, which is the current fiscal year. There's an additional $161 million in HB 30 for the next two fiscal years. This includes across the two budgets $320 million to support the widening of I-64 between Richmond and Hampton Road so that the entire interstate will be three lanes wide. In addition to the $320 million provided for this project, there's contingent language that would provide another $150 million contingent on a year-end surplus at the end of this fiscal year. This funding would free up VDOT funds, transportation funds for other projects throughout the state. In addition to that, there's $79 million to support physical multi-use trails across the 3 fiscal years. There's $30 million to support the Mid-Atlantic Regional Spaceport improvements at the space pad, $10 million for the Nemo Parkway project, $5 million to start planning for the replacement of the Norris Bridge, and $5 million in fiscal year 23 to support the Transit Riders Incentive Fund. In addition to that, there was about $1 billion in capital for port investments included in the introduced budget for 3 specific projects, and all of this funding is retained in the conference report. For other transportation amendments includes $10 million for small water dredging projects, shallow water dredging projects. This includes $2.5 million each year in the Waterway Maintenance Fund, which increases it to $4 million each year, and this would continue to be ongoing funding. And then there's $5 million in one-time funding for capital outlay. In addition to that, there's a $15 million transfer in 23 and 24 from VDOT's road maintenance item in the budget to the locally maintained roads item in the budget for VDOT. And JLARC did a study and found that the locally maintained roads needed further improvement compared to the ones that are maintained by VDOT. And now I will give it back to Ann.
Just wanted to close out with a few of the more global items. So you can bring it all together in terms of ARPA spending. You've heard some of the particular items from the various analysts, but as you may recall, Virginia received $4.3 billion in the state and local relief funds under ARPA. The 2021 special session last summer appropriated about $3.2 billion of that, leaving $1.1 billion available for your appropriation this year. The conference report appropriates almost all of that, leaving about $21 million for future appropriations. We have not included every item here, but kind of categorized them by the primary priorities, which were driven by the federal rules on the use of the funds. The biggest chunk goes to water and sewer projects. As you can see, there's about $184 million there for infrastructure improvements across the Commonwealth. The CSO funds that David had mentioned, there's about just under $160 million for public health initiatives. You heard about the Rebuild Virginia funding and the teacher bonus. There's about $105 million for mental health projects across the state, the equipment fund for public safety, and then a number of smaller initiatives within Commerce Ag. In both the House and the Senate budgets, we had also set aside a substantial amount of funding to deposit into the VEC Trust Fund. If you don't see that in here, that's because the earlier special session had said that any of the coronavirus relief funds, which were the initial federal bill that were unspent for the items for which they were allocated, would go to the VEC Trust Fund. There was enough balances available, so that freed up that ARPA fund. But there is a substantial deposit going to the VEC Trust Fund, which ensures that there is no fund builder tax and the rates remain steady at the current year levels with no inclusion of rate increases for ARPA experience, or not ARPA, COVID experience. This just lists some of the smaller items throughout the ARPA funding. In total, there's $1.1 billion in ARPA funding included in central appropriations. I believe it's item 486 of this budget, if anyone wants to look at the details. You've also heard staff mention that there's a number of contingent spending items. As we have gone through the long spring here, it appears that we will have a very substantial surplus in the current fiscal year. Of course, the first requirement is the constitutional requirement that you set aside any funds required for the rainy day fund. But language, again, in central accounts does set out that the next $585 million will go for some specific items. First, $250 million to the VRS, bringing the extra deposit to that to $1 billion. Michael mentioned the $150 million to I-64, which would give $470 million to that project. When you add in other federal and regional authority funds, that would fully fund that project. $50 million additional for the Business Ready Sites program, $100 million in capital supplements for projects that are already out to bid. I'm sure everyone's aware that we're seeing a lot of cost increases and inflation in capital projects as well as supply chain issues. So I want to ensure that we can fund the projects that have already started. And finally, the extra pre-deposit to the Amazon fund. That does not go to Amazon before they meet their performance requirements, but it is set aside for that purpose. The last slide we have here before you today, a very small font and kind of hard to read, but we try to keep it on one page. It was all of the items that were not included in either budget. This is one of the requirements that we present this when we present the conference report. Most of them are more minor and technical nature items that simply had been left out. But I'm sure there's been some substantial discussion about a few of them. In particular, there's language listed down there towards the bottom under item 494 related to the provision of additional casino licenses. That's language under the lottery, as well as language related to sports betting, also under the lottery, and a Part 4 amendment relating to the cannabis product. And finally, there were 4 bills that are included in 3-5.24. These were sales tax exemptions that sunset this year, and someone had missed the fact that they were sunsetting. This included the all the sales tax holidays, the back-to-school sales tax, the hurricane sales tax holiday. So those were put in there. They were extended just for 1 more year. We felt that we didn't want them to expire without the General Assembly having considered them, but wanted to give you the opportunity to decide next year whether those all should continue or not. And with that, I guess we'll hand it back to the chairman, ask whether there are any questions.
What is the total cost of the I-64 project with these two allocations, and then we're going to get other money too for it?
They estimated at $750 million.
During John's presentation, one quick question: can a school division apply for the grants and a loan to the Liberty Fund?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, do we have a long-term plan for CCAMP? It's like every year we're trying to bail them out a little bit. We did it. I didn't read the exact language. Is there an end point to this?
I think the hope that when the debt is relieved, which this budget does include, it's $5.9 million, that should reduce their operating costs enough that hopefully they will be able to get it together. If not, you can revisit that, and then you won't have a building encumbered if you decide it might be better for a future use. But the debt had to be addressed one way or another.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I just have a question about the I-64 funding as well. I was just curious whether or not that is something that would normally go through Smart Scale, or how we came about the directing funding directly to this particular project.
It typically would go through Smart Scale, and they could still benefit from some Smart Scale funding. It came over in the introduced budget at a lower level, but when we realized there was funding available, thought that was a good one-time use, number one, and also that it would give VDOT more money to spend elsewhere. So the dollar amount was kind of driven by the revenues available and what they anticipate getting from the Central Virginia and the Hampton Roads regional authorities, as well as some federal grants, since it is an interstate project. But it is atypical. There was, because of the size of the surplus last summer, 1/3 of the remaining goes to transportation, and that was included among the package that Governor Northam sent forward in the caboose bill.
David?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess with respect to the support positions, because I was glad to see funding in there for the 20 positions per 1,000 ADM and then the 21. Can you put that into a little bit of context in terms of where we are currently and then where we ought to have been had we not had that cap or if we looked at the cap earlier?
And that to Zach.
So currently we're funding about 17.5 per thousand, and the first year we get to 20 per thousand.
What was it before we took the cap on back many years ago?
I don't know what it was then.
Yeah, there never was a cap prior to that, and it was unique in that you have caps on the number of teachers and principals. They had just been funding, I think, support positions as a other operating cost while it was implemented during the Great Recession as a budgetary savings. I think they also had a policy perspective that why are we allowing schools to decide exactly how many non-teachers, non-educational personnel, although the support personnel includes support positions just as well as janitorial and custodial and that sort of thing. But I think at the time, they thought it was a good idea to have some sort of a cap. That's a debate for you all to have going forward on where that should be, but it was the only segment of personnel that didn't have a ratio attached to it.
Okay, looks good.
Thank you.
Okay, we see no other questions, so we'll adjourn the briefing and really want to thank Ann and her staff. Thank you very much.